The navy button-down shirt hung pressed and waiting on my bedroom door. I smoothed my hands over the fabric one final time, checking for any imperfection that might give my sister-in-law ammunition for her subtle barbs. 3 years of Thanksgiving dinners at Mara's house had taught me that every detail mattered in her perfectly curated world. The apple crumble sat cooling on my kitchen counter, its golden lattice crust achieving exactly the shade I'd hoped for. I'd spent the morning perfecting it, using my grandmother's recipe that had never failed to earn compliments. The bottle of Pinot Noir, a good vintage, not cheap but not ostentatious, waited beside it. I believed in bringing gifts that showed thoughtfulness without appearing to try too hard. My phone buzzed with a text from my wife, Elise. "Running late at the salon. Meet you there at 2?" I frowned. We'd planned to arrive together, to present a united front against Mara's inevitable commentary about our marriage, our lack of children, my choice to work in intellectual property law rather than something more dynamic like her husband Derek's hedge fund career. "Sure," I typed back, though disappointment settled in my chest like a stone. The drive to Riverside took 25 minutes through suburbs that grew progressively more manicured. Mara's Tudor-style house commanded its corner lot with aggressive perfection, every shrub trimmed to geometric precision, every window gleaming, the driveway freshly sealed and marked with lines straight enough to satisfy an engineer. I parked behind Derek's BMW and grabbed my offerings from the passenger seat. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and that crisp promise of winter that had always made Thanksgiving feel magical when I was young. Now it just felt like armor I needed to put on. Elise's car wasn't there yet, but that didn't surprise me. She'd been increasingly unpredictable lately, showing up late to our own dinner reservations, forgetting conversations we'd had the day before. I'd attributed it to stress from her event planning business, but something deeper nagged at me. I climbed the 3 stone steps to Mara's front door, my reflection wavering in the polished brass knocker. Through the sidelights, I could see warm light spilling from the dining room, hear the low murmur of conversation and laughter. My stomach tightened with that familiar combination of hope and dread. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe Mara would be genuinely welcoming instead of performing hospitality like a one-woman show. Maybe Derek would engage me in conversation about something other than how much money his latest acquisition was making. Maybe Elise and I could sit close together, her hand finding mine under the table like it used to. I knocked twice, balancing the crumble and wine in one arm while smoothing my shirt with the other. The door swung open. Mara stood there in a cranberry-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her smile was sharp as winter wind. "You're not invited," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of satisfaction she reserved for delivering bad news. "Go home." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood there, mouth slightly open, sure I'd misheard. "Excuse me?" Her smile widened. "You heard me. Run along now." That's when I saw past her into the dining room, and the world tilted sideways. Elise sat at the head of the table where I'd expected to find myself. Her hair was perfectly styled, her laugh bright and genuine, in a way it hadn't been with me in months. To her left sat Garrett Williamson, her ex-husband, the pharmaceutical sales rep she'd divorced 5 years ago because he was emotionally unavailable and career-obsessed. And pouring wine into her glass with intimate familiarity was Troy Halden. Troy, her high school boyfriend, the one she'd claimed to run into accidentally at Whole Foods 3 months ago. The one she'd mentioned was just a friend catching up when she started taking mysterious phone calls in other rooms. I watched Troy's hand linger on her shoulder, watched her lean into the touch, watched my entire marriage reveal itself as the elaborate lie it had become. "There's been a mistake," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew there hadn't been. This was deliberate, calculated, cruel. Mara's eyes glittered with malicious glee, the kind of light you see when someone knows they've landed a perfect blow. "No mistake," she said, her voice honeyed but laced with poison. "Just a change of plans. You understand." I looked past her again. Elise hadn't so much as glanced toward the door, not a flicker of acknowledgement. She was leaning in toward Garrett, laughing at something he'd said, her head tilted back just enough for Troy to let his hand trace slow, lazy circles on the bare skin between her dress and shoulder blade. The gesture was casual, intimate in the way that comes from long practice. The apple crumble suddenly felt impossibly heavy in my arms, like I was holding the weight of every wasted year. The wine bottle seemed to double in density, pressing into my ribs like a reminder of the fool I'd been. I set them both down on the porch steps with deliberate care, the foil on the crumble crinkling softly in the cold air. My hands stayed steady despite the earthquake happening somewhere in my chest. "I see," I said quietly, almost conversationally. Mara's smile faltered, just slightly. She'd expected protest, anger, maybe a desperate plea for understanding. What she got was stillness, calm, and something she couldn't quite read. "Nathaniel, don't make this—" "Thank you for clarifying," I interrupted, my tone cutting cleanly through her attempt at faux concern. "Happy Thanksgiving." I turned and walked back to my car with measured steps, spine straight, jaw locked, and expression blank. The night air was sharp enough to sting my lungs. Somewhere behind me, I thought I heard Mara call my name, but I didn't slow down. Only when I was inside, doors closed and locked, did I let my fingers tighten on the steering wheel, the leather creaking under the strain. The silence inside the car was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own breathing, slow, controlled, deliberate. They hadn't just excluded me. They had erased me. Not a seat left vacant in silent acknowledgement. Not a word of explanation. No recognition of 6 years of marriage, of the business Elise and I had built from the ground up, of the home we'd shared and the sacrifices I'd made. It was as if I had been a placeholder in someone else's life, a name to be edited out of the story when the real cast arrived. I sat there for exactly 30 seconds, letting the rage and heartbreak rise and crest, not fighting it, just letting it burn through me. Then, like a tide pulling back from shore, it receded, leaving behind something sharper, colder. Clarity. I reached for my phone, thumb scrolling until it landed on the number I had promised myself I'd never use in a moment like this. Not on a holiday. Not unless there was no coming back. Alton Reyes picked up on the second ring. "Nathaniel, everything all right?" "Start the process," I said, my voice as steady and immovable as granite. "All of it." There was a pause. "Today?" "Right now." I heard him inhale slowly. Alton had been warning me for months, softly at first, then more directly, that Elise's moves were those of someone planning an exit on her terms, not mine. I'd brushed him off, clinging to the hope that loyalty and shared history still meant something. "I'll make the calls," he said finally. "Emergency filings will be in place by Monday morning." "Make it happen." I ended the call and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, Mara's windows glowed with warm light, silhouettes moving against the golden backdrop. I could almost hear the conversation inside, relief that I'd gone quietly, maybe even disappointment that I hadn't given them a performance to pick apart over dessert. They thought they'd ended the story. They had no idea what they'd just set in motion. By Monday morning at 8:15 a.m., every joint account Elise and I shared had been frozen, our business credit lines suspended, the corporate accounts for Elise Crane events locked pending legal review. I sat in my office, watching the early November light filter through floor-to-ceiling windows, and felt a cold satisfaction settle in my bones. Alton hadn't wasted any time. Emergency motions filed at 6 a.m., temporary restraining orders in place by 7:30, and by 8 a.m., even the coffee shop credit card linked to our business account had been declined. My phone buzzed with the first of what I knew would be many frantic calls. "Nathaniel, what the hell is happening?" Elise's voice was shrill, panicked. "I can't access our accounts. The bank says there's a legal hold." "Good morning, Elise." "Don't good morning me. I have vendor payments due today. The Hamilton wedding is this weekend, and I can't pay for flowers or catering or—" "That sounds like a problem." The silence stretched between us, taut as a wire. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to that dangerous whisper she used when she was truly angry. "You can't do this." "I can. I have. You should speak to your attorney." "My attorney?" "Nathaniel, we can work this out. Whatever happened at Thanksgiving—" "What happened at Thanksgiving," I interrupted, "is that I finally saw clearly." I hung up and immediately called Kayla into my office. "I need you to document every call that comes in from Elise or anyone representing her. Record times, topics, any threats or admissions, and start pulling together a complete file of every business decision she's made without my approval over the past 6 months." Kayla nodded, her expression professionally neutral. She'd worked for me for 3 years and had witnessed enough of Elise's increasingly erratic behavior to understand what was happening. Within an hour, she poked her head through my office door. "Jonas Mitchell is on line 2, says it's urgent." Jonas had been our accountant for 4 years, handling both personal and business finances. He was meticulous, careful, and completely trustworthy, which is why what he told me hit like a sledgehammer. "She submitted documents to her attorney on Friday," he said without preamble. "A prenup amendment." I felt my blood turn to ice. "We don't have a prenup. According to these papers, you signed one 3 years ago, giving her 70% of all business assets and intellectual property." "That's impossible." "The signature looks authentic." "But Nathaniel, I have your original incorporation documents right here. Your signature from 3 years ago looks different, substantially different." Forgery. She had forged my signature on a fake prenup, thinking she could steal the business I'd built from the ground up while she played house with her ex-husband and high school sweetheart. "Can you prove it's forged?" "Already on it. I've contacted Dr. Sarah Chen, the best handwriting expert in the state. She'll need original samples, but preliminary analysis suggests significant discrepancies in pen pressure, letter formation, and signature flow patterns." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. I'd built Crane Intellectual Property Services from nothing, establishing relationships with inventors, tech startups, and Fortune 500 companies who trusted me to protect their most valuable assets. Elise had been the public face, schmoozing at networking events and playing hostess at corporate dinners, but the foundation, the licenses, the contracts, the specialized knowledge, was mine. She'd underestimated me, badly. "Jonas, I need you to do something else." "Name it." "Send termination notices to every vendor and client that has contracts with Elise Crane Events. As of today, she's no longer affiliated with any business bearing the Crane name. Remove her access to all systems, all accounts, all professional networks." That's comprehensive. She wanted to erase me from her life. Let's see how she likes being erased from mine. By Tuesday morning, my phone was ringing constantly. Vendors, clients, and business contacts were all trying to understand what was happening. I fielded each call personally, my voice calm and professional. "This is Nathaniel Crane." "Mr. Crane, this is Angela from Pristine Florals. We can't reach Elise about the Henderson anniversary party, and our invoice from last month is still unpaid." "I understand your concern, Angela. Elise Crane Events is no longer authorized to use the Crane business accounts. You'll need to work directly with Mrs. Crane on a personal basis going forward." "But the check she wrote bounced, and I'd recommend requiring cash payment for any future services." The conversation was repeated with caterers, photographers, venue coordinators, and musicians. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit wedding industry network that Elise Crane Events was in financial trouble. By Tuesday afternoon, Elise's largest client, Meridian Tech, whose patent portfolio I'd personally assembled, had canceled their Christmas gala. The company's CEO, James Westbrook, called me directly. "Nathaniel, I have to ask, is there something we should know about your wife's business practices?" "James, I'd recommend working directly with established event planning companies that have verified insurance and bonding. I can provide some referrals if you'd like." "That would be helpful. And Nathaniel, I hope everything works out for you personally." By Wednesday, 3 more corporate clients had pulled their events. The dominoes were falling exactly as I'd anticipated. But I wasn't finished. Wednesday afternoon, I made a series of strategic calls to people who had been clients before Elise and I were married. relationships I'd built that she'd gradually taken over. Marcus? It's Nathaniel Crane. I wanted to reach out personally about some changes in my business structure. Marcus Holloway had been one of my first clients, a brilliant inventor whose patents on water purification systems had made him wealthy beyond his dreams. He'd always felt more comfortable dealing with me than with Elise. Nathaniel, good to hear from you. What's going on? I'm restructuring my business operations. Going forward, I'll be handling all client relationships personally through Crane IP Services. The event planning division is being discontinued. Honestly, that's probably for the best. Elise always seemed a little intense. Marcus wasn't the only one who felt that way. As I made my rounds, I discovered that several long-term clients had been considering switching firms because they found Elise abrasive and unprofessional. They'd stayed out of loyalty to me, not her. By Thursday morning, I'd secured meetings with 6 major clients to discuss expanding our intellectual property services. What Elise had seen as my boring legal work was about to become significantly more profitable than her event planning had ever been. Dr. Sarah Chen's report arrived Thursday afternoon, 42 pages of devastating analysis that demolished any possibility of Elise's prenup being legitimate. The question signature shows clear indicators of forgery, she concluded. Tracing patterns suggest the signer was copying from an exemplar rather than writing naturally. Pen pressure inconsistencies, letter formation discrepancies, and unnatural hesitation marks all point to fraudulent reproduction. I forwarded the report to Alton, who called within minutes. This is criminal fraud, Nathaniel. Forgery of legal documents, attempted theft of business assets, we're talking potential federal charges. What's our next move? I'm filing additional motions tomorrow, asset preservation orders, demands for the return of any documents she's removed from your offices, and a motion to compel her to produce the original prenup she claims exists. She can't produce what doesn't exist. Exactly. And when she fails to produce it, we move for sanctions and refer the matter to the district attorney's office. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. Mara herself appeared in my office reception area, looking far less composed than she had at Thanksgiving dinner. I need to speak with you, she announced, pushing past Kayla without waiting for permission. You have 5 minutes, I said, not looking up from the contracts I was reviewing. This has gone far enough, Nathaniel. Elise is staying in our guest room, crying constantly, unable to work. She made a mistake, but destroying her life isn't the answer. I set down my pen and looked at her directly. Did she tell you about the forged prenup? Mara's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flush that crept up her neck. She said there was some confusion about documents. Confusion? She forged my signature on fake legal papers to steal my business. That's not confusion, Mara. That's felony fraud. You're being vindictive. This is about your hurt feelings, not... Get out of my office. Nathaniel. Now. She left, her designer heels clicking angrily on the marble floor. I made a note to have building security add her to the list of people who weren't welcome without an appointment. My masterstroke came Friday afternoon, the Riverside Country Club booking, Elise's biggest contract of the year. What she'd never known was that 2 years ago I'd invested in Prestige Hospitality Group, the management company that controlled event bookings at 3 of the region's most exclusive venues, including Riverside. It had been a smart investment, returning 12% annually while giving me insights into the event planning industry. I called Richard Stern, the general manager, Friday at 4 p.m. Richard, I need to discuss the Hampton New Year's Eve booking. The Elise Crane Events contract? Beautiful party planned. 200 guests, full orchestra. I need to cancel it. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Nathaniel, that's a $250,000 event. The deposit alone was $50,000. And it's being organized by someone who no longer has access to the funds necessary to guarantee payment. We can't expose the club to that liability. But the contract... Check the fine print, Richard. All event contracts require proof of financial capability. As of Monday, Elise Crane Events has been operating with frozen accounts and no liquid capital. Richard sighed deeply. I'll need to discuss this with the board, but You're right about the financial requirements. I'll call the Hamptons this afternoon. Tell them I can recommend 3 other excellent planners who could handle their event. None of them will be able to replicate what Elise had planned on such short notice. That's unfortunate for everyone involved. But the country club cancellation was just the beginning. Through my network of business contacts, I learned that Elise had been using our joint credit cards to pay deposits for events scheduled through March. With those accounts frozen, she was suddenly liable for thousands of dollars in vendor agreements she couldn't fulfill. That evening, as I worked late in my office, Kayla knocked on my door. "You need to see this," she said, holding out her phone. Elise was broadcasting live on Instagram, sitting in what looked like Mara's kitchen. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her makeup streaked with tears, and her voice trembled with what I recognized as carefully calculated emotion. "I know some of you have heard rumors," she began, addressing the camera with the same practiced sincerity she used with difficult clients. "About my marriage, about my business, I want you to hear the truth from me." I watched, fascinated, as she spun a narrative that painted her as the victim of a vindictive husband who couldn't handle her success. She claimed I was sabotaging her business out of spite, freezing accounts she had every right to access, destroying relationships she'd spent years building. "He's trying to punish me for being independent," she sobbed, "for building something that was mine. He can't stand that I was successful without him." What she didn't anticipate was the comment section. "Didn't you cheat on him?" typed someone named at Jennifer K. Photography. "Girl, nobody feels sorry for you," added at Events by Michelle. "We all know what you did." "Maybe don't mess around with your ex while married," suggested at Bridal Bliss Boston. "Team Nathaniel all the way," declared at Flowers by Faith. The comments kept coming, and they weren't sympathetic. The tight-knit event planning community had been watching our marriage deteriorate for months, and many of them had seen Elise's increasingly unprofessional behavior firsthand. "Oh, honey, no," typed at Cakes by Carla. "You can't cry victim when everyone knows about Thanksgiving dinner. Posting this just proves you're not ready to be a professional," added at Weddings by Wendy. Within an hour, screenshots of the comments were circulating on every professional networking group in the city. By morning, the video had been shared hundreds of times, but not in the way she'd intended. The public sympathy she'd expected never materialized. Instead, she'd broadcasted her desperation to everyone who might have considered hiring her, while simultaneously confirming every whispered suspicion about her character. Saturday morning brought a new wave of calls, but these weren't from clients. They were from vendors demanding payment for services already rendered. "Mr. Crane, this is Tony from Artistic Florals. We did the Morrison wedding last month and the check from your wife bounced. We need payment today or we're filing a lien." I'd fielded 17 similar calls by noon. Florists, caterers, photographers, musicians, all owed money by Elise Crane Events, all discovering that their payment source had disappeared overnight. But the most interesting call came from Detective Patricia Walsh of the Financial Crimes Unit. "Mr. Crane, I understand you filed a complaint regarding forged documents?" "That's correct. My attorney has submitted all the evidence. I'll need to schedule an interview with you early next week. This appears to be a clear case of attempted fraud, and we take that very seriously." After I hung up, I sat quietly in my office, looking out at the city skyline. 6 days ago, I'd been the excluded husband, dismissed and erased from a family gathering. Now, I was the complainant in a criminal fraud investigation, and Elise was facing the complete collapse of everything she'd tried to steal. But I wasn't finished yet. By the following Monday, the secondary effects of my strategy were becoming apparent. Elise's professional reputation wasn't just damaged, it was toxic. Word had spread through industry networks that she was involved in legal proceedings, couldn't pay her vendors, and had been dropped by major clients. The wedding industry operated on referrals and reputation. A planner who couldn't be trusted to pay bills or honor contracts was a planner who would never work again. I received a call from Beverly Chen, a wedding planner who had sometimes partnered with Elise on larger events. "Nathaniel, I have to ask, what exactly is going on with Elise's business?" Beverly, I'd recommend you protect yourself legally if you have any ongoing partnerships with her. Make sure all financial arrangements are documented and secured. That bad? I can't comment on ongoing legal proceedings, but I'd suggest being very careful. Beverly wasn't the only one calling for advice. 3 other planners, 2 photographers, and a caterer all reached out, suddenly concerned about their professional associations with someone who was rapidly becoming persona non grata. The isolation was complete. Even people who had considered Elise a friend were distancing themselves, unwilling to risk their own reputations by association. On Thursday morning, I drove to Mara's house with divorce papers in a manila envelope on my passenger seat, along with a folder containing copies of the forensic handwriting analysis, financial records, and Detective Walsh's preliminary fraud investigation report. I'd dressed carefully, the same navy button-down I'd worn to Thanksgiving, pressed slacks, leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. If this was going to be our final scene, I wanted to look like a man in control of his life. The neighborhood looked different in daylight. What had seemed impressive and intimidating on Thanksgiving now looked simply expensive and soulless. Perfect lawns with no children playing on them, pristine driveways with no oil stains, houses that looked more like museum displays than homes. Troy answered the door in boxers and a wrinkled t-shirt, his hair sticking up at odd angles. The smugness from Thanksgiving was gone, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. His eyes were bloodshot, and he smelled like stale beer and regret. "She's not here," he said quickly, already starting to close the door. "Her car's in the driveway. Look, man, maybe we can work something out. Move." Something in my voice made him step aside. He'd probably been expecting this confrontation since Thanksgiving, had maybe even rehearsed what he'd say. But now, faced with the reality of a man who'd spent 10 days methodically destroying his opponent's life, he had nothing. I walked past him into the foyer where I could hear voices coming from the kitchen. Mara's sharp tones, Derek's deeper rumble, and Elise's increasingly frantic responses. "Telling you we need to fix this before it gets worse," Mara was saying. "Get her a better lawyer, pay off some of the vendors, show that she's trying to make things right." "With what money?" Derek replied. "You want me to bankroll her legal defense after what she did, after she dragged our family name into this mess? She made mistakes, but she's my sister, and—" They fell silent when I appeared in the doorway. The scene was a far cry from the perfect Thanksgiving tableau I'd witnessed 10 days ago. The kitchen table was covered with legal papers, unpaid bills, and what looked like printouts of social media comments. Elise sat hunched over a laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard with desperate energy. She looked terrible. Her hair was unwashed, pulled back in a messy bun. The designer clothes had been replaced by yoga pants and an oversized sweater. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her skin had the pale, unhealthy look of someone who'd been living on stress and coffee. Nathaniel. She stood up from the kitchen table, hope flickering across her face like a candle in a hurricane. "I'm glad you're here. We need to talk about—" "No," I said quietly, pulling the envelope from my jacket. "We don't—" I set the papers on the granite counter between us with the same ceremonial precision I'd used when setting down the apple crumble on her sister's porch. "You've been served." The silence stretched so long I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of children playing in someone else's backyard. Mara was the first to break it. "You can't be serious. This is just a misunderstanding that got out of hand." I looked at her with the same cold politeness I'd reserved for a stranger. "The fraud investigation will determine that." "Fraud?" Derek's voice cracked slightly. He was a hedge fund manager, smart enough to understand that criminal fraud charges could destroy more than just Elise's life. They could impact his own professional reputation through association. Forged signatures on legal documents attempting to steal business assets. Detective Walsh's preliminary investigation found sufficient evidence to proceed with criminal charges. I pulled out the second folder and placed it beside the divorce papers. Dr. Chen's forensic analysis of the documents Elise submitted to her attorney. 42 pages documenting how she forged my signature on a fake prenup. Elise's face had gone white. "Nathaniel, please, we can work this out. I made mistakes, but—" "You didn't make mistakes," I said calmly. "You made choices. You chose to have an affair. You chose to exclude me from family gatherings. You chose to forge legal documents. You chose to try to steal my business." Troy stepped closer, trying to insert himself into the conversation with the kind of bravado that suggested he'd been drinking since breakfast. "Hey, buddy, maybe you should calm down and—" "Walk away." I didn't raise my voice, didn't change my expression, didn't even look directly at him. Right now. There was something in my tone, a quality of absolute finality, that made him step back. This wasn't the hurt, confused husband he'd seen on Thanksgiving. This was someone who'd spent 10 days learning exactly how much power he wielded when he decided to use it. Derek cleared his throat. "Nathaniel, surely we can discuss this reasonably. Elise has made some poor decisions, but criminal charges seem excessive." "Do they?" She forged legal documents to steal a business worth over $2 million. In most jurisdictions, that's grand theft and fraud in the first degree. 5 to 10 years in state prison. The numbers hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Even Mara had gone quiet. I looked at Elise one last time, really looked at her. 6 years of marriage, 2 years of dating before that, countless shared dreams and whispered promises. All of it burning down to this moment in her sister's perfect kitchen, surrounded by the wreckage of her own choices. "I gave you everything I had," I said softly. "My love, my trust, my business connections, my professional reputation. I built a life around making you happy, and you threw it away for what? A few hours of nostalgia with your high school boyfriend? The thrill of humiliating me in front of your family?" Tears were streaming down her face now, genuine ones that had nothing to do with performance or manipulation. "I know I hurt you, but please don't destroy me. Don't destroy my whole life over this." "I'm not destroying anything," I replied. "I'm just no longer protecting you from the consequences of your own actions." I picked up the empty envelope from the counter and folded it precisely in half. "We're even now." As I turned to leave, Troy made one last attempt at salvaging his dignity. "You think you're so perfect? You think you never did anything wrong in your marriage?" I stopped at the kitchen doorway and looked back at him. He was trying to look defiant, but I could see the fear underneath. He'd gotten involved with a married woman thinking it would be a simple affair, maybe a chance to relive his glory days. Instead, he'd walked into a legal and financial nightmare that would follow him for years. "The difference between us," I said, "is that I never pretended to be something I wasn't. I was exactly who I appeared to be, a husband who loved his wife and trusted his family. You're a middle-aged man who seduces married women for sport. Elise is a woman who destroys everything good in her life because she's afraid of being happy. And Mara is someone who values appearances over integrity." I looked at each of them in turn. "I don't need to destroy any of you. You're doing that perfectly well yourselves." Then I walked out of their lives forever. Behind me, I could hear Elise sobbing, Mara's frantic attempts at damage control, Derek's angry muttering about professional liability and reputation management. But their voices faded as I reached my car, and by the time I'd driven out of their perfect subdivision, they might as well have been strangers discussing someone else's problems. The manila envelope on my passenger seat was empty now, but I felt lighter than I had in years. The hearing took place on a slate-gray December morning, the kind that felt damp even indoors. Judge Patricia Holbrook's courtroom was warm but carried the faint scent of old wood polish and legal paper, a smell that always reminded me of permanence. She was known for her no-nonsense approach to family law and her particular intolerance for deception. In other words, the perfect judge for this day. I sat beside Alton at the plaintiff's table, his legal pad already filled with crisp bullet points in his impossibly neat handwriting. He didn't fidget, didn't make small talk, just sat there with the quiet confidence of a man who knew the game was already over. Across the aisle, Elise huddled with her attorney, Rebecca Chen. She was young, fresh out of law school by the look of her, with sharp cheekbones and a suit that didn't quite fit right. She scanned the evidence binder with the haunted expression of someone realizing they'd been handed a case that was less difficult and more a career hazard. Every few minutes, she leaned in to whisper something to Elise, who sat stiffly, chin lifted in a posture of defiance that was betrayed by the constant tapping of her manicured nails on the table. The evidence was a sledgehammer, and Alton had wielded it with surgical precision. The handwriting analysis showing the forged signature, the document metadata proving exactly when the fake prenup amendment had been generated, months after the date typed at the top. The digital trail showing which device it came from, right down to the IP address in our old home office. Elise had gambled everything on a lie and lost. When Judge Holbrook finally entered, the room fell into that thick, expectant silence unique to courtrooms. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and began without preamble. "In the matter of Crane versus Crane," she said, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years on the bench, "I find sufficient evidence of fraudulent documentation to warrant criminal referral." Rebecca Chen's shoulders stiffened. Elise turned sharply toward her, eyes widening just enough to betray fear. Rebecca leaned in, whispering urgently. Elise's lips pressed into a tight line. The judge continued, her tone unflinching. "Furthermore, I am granting a permanent injunction preventing the defendant from accessing any business accounts, intellectual property, or client relationships associated with Crane Intellectual Property Services." The words landed like a gavel strike inside my chest. The business I had built from nothing, the one Elise had tried to claim, was now completely, legally, irrevocably mine. Holbrook wasn't done. Asset division will reflect the actual contributions of each party to the marriage. 70% of joint assets are awarded to the plaintiff. For a moment, Elise's jaw actually dropped. She caught herself quickly, but the damage was done. Everyone in that room had seen it. She had gotten exactly what she'd tried to take from me, except now she was the one watching it slip away. Her small catering business, the one she'd always treated as her personal escape hatch, was hers to keep. The court wouldn't touch it. But without my professional network, my vendor relationships, and the reputation that had shielded her from her own poor decisions, it was a dead branch still clinging to the tree. The collapse was faster than even I expected. By January, vendors had stopped returning her calls. Clients quietly withdrew deposits, citing changes in project scope. Garrett vanished first, retreating to his pharmaceutical sales territory in Ohio with all the speed of a man who suddenly remembered he had a life somewhere else. Troy lasted another couple of weeks before he was spotted on Instagram, shirtless and grinning in Cabo with a woman young enough to be his niece. By February, Elise was living in a cramped studio apartment in Brookfield, a far cry from the house she'd once demanded I renovate to project the right image. She was working for someone else's event planning company now, tucked in a corner cubicle and answering phones for a salary that barely covered her rent. The woman who had once measured her worth in designer heels and exclusive guest lists was now bringing instant coffee to budget-conscious brides. And me? I walked out of that courthouse that December morning into air so cold it burned my lungs, and I'd never breathed easier. My first Christmas as a divorced man was the most peaceful I'd had in years. Instead of the elaborate productions at Mara's house or the tense gift exchanges that had characterized recent holidays with Elise, I hosted a small dinner in my downtown condo. Alton and his wife Maria came, along with Kayla and her husband, and my neighbor Clara Hartwell, who'd gone through her own messy divorce 2 years earlier. Clara was an art therapist with kind eyes and a laugh that came from somewhere genuine. We'd started talking more frequently after my separation, first just neighborly conversations in the hallway, then coffee on Sunday mornings, then dinners that stretched late into the evening. She understood what it felt like to rebuild a life from the ground up. "You look happy," she said as we cleaned dishes after everyone had gone home. "I am," I realized, and meant it completely. The business was thriving. Without Elise's expensive tastes and questionable judgment draining resources, I'd been able to invest in new technology and hire 2 additional associates. Client referrals were up 30% from the previous year. But more than professional success, I'd found something I hadn't even realized I'd lost: peace. In March, almost 4 months after that Thanksgiving door slam, I received a text from an unfamiliar number. "You win. I hope you're happy." 7 words. No greeting, no name, no punctuation beyond the period that felt like a jab. But I didn't need a signature. I knew the cadence, the subtle twist of making surrender sound like accusation. It was Elise's specialty, turning her losses into implied crimes by the other person. I sat back in my office chair, the soft hum of my computer filling the silence. Outside, late winter sunlight reflected off the neighboring buildings, pale and brittle. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, a dozen possible replies flashing through my mind in rapid succession. Razor-sharp comebacks, cutting truths, lines that would leave her staring at her screen with her jaw clenched. But one by one, they dissolved. The truth was, this wasn't about winning or losing. That framework, where love was a competition and marriage a battlefield where every smile hid a maneuver, was hers, not mine. I'd stepped off that field months ago. My life no longer revolved around scoring points or defending territory. This was about choosing not to keep enabling something destructive, no matter how familiar it had once felt. About building something real, steady, honest, and worth waking up for, instead of maintaining a structure that had been rotting from the inside out. I set the phone down on the desk, screen still glowing for a few seconds before fading to black. I didn't need to answer. Silence was its own reply, cleaner and heavier than any words I could send. After a moment, I picked it back up, not to type, but to delete the message. It vanished from my inbox, leaving no trace except for the faint relief in my chest. Then I turned back to my laptop and went back to work. The contracts waiting in my inbox weren't going to sign themselves. And unlike the marriage I'd just walked away from, these agreements were built to last. The lake house in New Hampshire was exactly what I'd hoped it would be: rustic without being primitive, isolated without being lonely. I'd bought it in September and spent weekends through the fall getting it ready for winter. This Thanksgiving, I woke to frost on the windows and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen timer. No elaborate preparations, no anxiety about impression management, no walking on eggshells around people who'd never really wanted me there anyway. Clara arrived at noon with homemade rolls and a smile that made the whole house feel warmer. We cooked together in comfortable quiet, listened to jazz while the turkey roasted, talked about books and travel plans, and whether I should adopt the stray cat that had been hanging around the property. As the afternoon light faded over the lake, I realized this was what happiness felt like. Not the desperate performance of it I'd mistaken for love with Elise, but the quiet certainty of being exactly where I belonged. I'd spent so many years trying to earn a place at someone else's table, I'd forgotten I could build my own. Sometimes the best revenge is living well, but sometimes it's simpler than that. Sometimes the best revenge is just living.